Good morning. I'm Kim Malley, the Senior Retail Insight Manager here at AHDB, and welcome to the first set of webinars by the Retail and Consumer Insight team. If you're new to what our team does, we're basically here to continuously track, monitor and evaluate consumer behaviour in order to provide the industry with up-to-date knowledge and understanding about consumer demand, needs and attitudes. Today's webinar is focusing on the changing market landscape for meat. This year has been totally unprecedented and one that we could have never predicted with COVID-19, and therefore we want to spend a bit of time today looking at how behaviours have changed from a retail and food service point of view, and most importantly, look at what we believe the future looks like in terms of opportunities and threats for the sectors. As mentioned, this is the first set of webinars hosted by the team, and I will touch on the second set, which are being held in November at the end. But first, some housekeeping points. We will aim to finish at about 5 to the hour, with the agenda being 40 minutes from us and then 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So all questions are being kept to the end. All participants are on mute throughout, but questions can be asked by typing in the questions box, which you should be able to see on the right-hand side in the control panel. If you can't see it, you can click the orange arrow to expand the taskbar, and there is a white arrow next to the word questions, which drops down and you can type in there. This session is being recorded and therefore will be hosted on the website after, in case you want to play anything back or pass the recording on. The presentation slides will be available for all participants after the session if they complete the 2-minute feedback survey, which either pops up at the end or comes to you via email. So if you do want the physical presentation to take away, please complete the feedback form. And this would be a good time to introduce our speakers for today. So first up, we have Rebecca Gladman, who is the Retail Insight Manager in the team with a keen interest and experience in the meat sector. She's going to spend about 25 to 30 minutes taking you through how meat demand and eating behaviour has been impacted by the pandemic, covering retail, eating out, takeaways and deliveries. Rebecca will then hand over to our guest speaker, Sarah Baker, for about 10 minutes before she wraps up with the summaries and recommendations. Sarah is our policy and economics expert at AHDB, and she will take us quickly through the economic factors that are at play currently. This will then lead into the Q&A session, which I will host at the end. So as I said, please get your questions through while we're going through the session, and we'll come back to them at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rebecca Gladman.
Okay, good morning, everyone. To say this year has been a challenge would be somewhat of an understatement, but I would have to say that the meat industry has made an incredible response to this massive shift in consumer demand. It's been both rapid and extreme, and what I want to take you through now is exactly what that change in demand looks like and how we can capitalise on some of the opportunities within this new normal. So first things first, how have we been shopping? So it's been well documented that the online channel, growth within this channel has been really accelerated within grocery during the pandemic as people look to, get their shopping without stepping out their front doors. Within meat, this has been a real challenge previously. People like to go in and pick their fresh foods, and we commissioned research in 2018 to look at some of the challenges here. And it's really great to see that online has managed to accelerate within meat as well as in total grocery. So this 4 percentage point increase in share change comes from people swapping their stores where they would normally go into a supermarket to instead shopping with their supermarket online. What's been really interesting as well is that butchers have had sustained growth during the pandemic. Unlike online, which was already in growth prior to the pandemic, it was just slower than it is now. Butchers were facing long-term declines. But actually, initially at the start of the lockdown, I thought that the growth of butchers was going to be somewhat of a flash in the pan, but actually it's been quite sustained over the last few months. And people are telling us that what they're enjoying is the additional quality, as well as being able to support local businesses there. So I think what this shows, it's really important to have a really good mixed presence. I think if you're a butcher in particular that's got online presence as well, and we've got a really great mix there of being able to get to your consumer. So where we shop is obviously linked to concerns around the coronavirus itself. And actually what this has done as well is change the basket sizes that we've been buying. So we see trip volume increase, but frequency of purchase decrease. And in our consumer tracker conducted, the latest wave conducted in August, a third of people said they are more likely to be making sure that their cupboards are full with food than they were prior to the pandemic. So this is likely to sustain baskets for some time, probably not to the same extent that we've been seeing in recent months. So what are we doing with all this extra food? Why do we need it? Well, obviously, the main thing is that we are not venturing out in the same way we were in February and earlier on. So many of us are able to work from home now, which is massively impacting footfall to food to go, food service, anything out of home. And the Institute of Grocery Distribution normally have a very good forecast for the food to go market, which includes things like sandwich meal deals, everything at the front of the store at the supermarket. But actually their forecast for this year has been downgraded to £11 billion, which is a 43% reduction year on year. And that equates to about £8 billion. So this reduction in footfall is having a massive impact. But even when we're at home, it's not business as usual. We've seen a bit more in movement towards scratch cooking. So this isn't a groundbreaking movement so far, but as recessionary behaviours set in, we expect more people to be scratch cooking. We saw it during the 2008 recession, and we think it will set in as people look to watch their household budgets. Also becoming more important is usage date of meat. So communicating things like freezability, value for money, because this is only second only to price as a priority during the pandemic now. But we're not, we're not eating all the same things we once were. We still want to celebrate, and all those occasions like our birthdays, anniversaries, etc. We want to find a way to celebrate. And I think barbecue season was a good example of this. It was really a record season for barbecues, even when compared to 2018, when it was great weather, we had the World Cup going on. The country was feeling pretty good, which is quite a contrast to where we are now. And actually, I think there's a lot of learnings from the summer occasion as we move into Christmas, as we know it's going to be a much smaller occasion and much more family orientated. But obviously, whilst there's benefits to the retail market, the out-of-home market has been heavily impacted. So when we were able to start dining out in July, there was pretty slow uptake to start with. And obviously this meant that the government brought in the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, where you can get up to 50% off your meal. And we can see how this stimulated visits to restaurants and pubs, for example. Obviously, here we can see the footfall to the Monday to Wednesday occasion. Massive spikes at the start of the week as people make the most of that offer. There was concern that this would affect value in the market. So the Monday to Wednesday out-of-home occasion pre-COVID was around £6, and this is £2.20 lower than the average spend on a weekend. So a massive difference there. However, the scheme does seem to have stimulated trade up. So either people having more items or trading up within their individual meals. So for example, from burgers to steaks. And we'll come back to what that looks like for beef in a minute. However, we have seen things ease back during September. The seasons are against us now. The scheme is no longer operating. So many food service operators are looking to stimulate visits and spend within their businesses. So some are extending the scheme themselves at their own cost. Many are shortening their menus and simplifying them, which is a real concern for lamb and primary pork, which are already underrepresented on out-of-home menus. So I think if you're a food service supplier, I think the important thing is to show how you can help the customer maintain a profitable business. And we have on our website the Meat Purchasing Guide, which can really help you find cheaper cuts, some more unloved cuts that can help your margins, but cooked in the right way can deliver a really delicious dish. So for retail, with these sort of losses within the out-of-home market, it means that total food and drink is up 12% in the latest 6 months. When we compare this for our proteins, it's pretty much in line for beef and pork, but lamb somewhat lags behind, and we'll come back to why that is in a minute. But whilst it's, it could be a negative thing to be seen that lamb is somewhat flat in terms of volumes, prior to COVID, so the 6 months to February, volumes were down 6% for lamb. For pork, they were down 4%. For beef, they were down 1%. So these increases are really significant. So what I'm going to take you through now is by protein, exactly what that uplift looks like and how it balances with the out-of-home volumes. So what we've done at AHDB, we've taken Kantar grocery volumes supplied by them, and then for the out-of-home market, we also use Kantar out-of-home data, but we create our own volume estimates based on guidance provided by the food standards agencies and also what's published on big brands' websites, the likes of McDonald's, KFC, Burger King, etc. So we can see prior to the pandemic that things were pretty flat for the beef market. However, as lockdown was announced, we saw a huge spike in retail sales. And the following month, we saw things ease back and the losses in the out-of-home market really started to set in. Beef peaked at plus 35% in volume terms in March alone. And this led to a real concern around carcass balance because it was really mince driving this. In those 4 weeks alone, Brits bought an additional 5 million kilos of mince. However, this carcass balance issue soon started to fade away. We introduced the Make It Steak campaign at AHDB along with other industry bodies, and also the retailers got on board by stimulating purchases via promotions, which really helped those sales via online as well. Normally steaks struggle online, but the promotions and the presence in those retailers' websites really helped stimulate volumes. So this pattern here for retail for beef really tracks the total grocery market. However, obviously we've got this balance here for the out-of-home market. And one thing to be said is that the brands have a really big influence here. And obviously at the start of lockdown on the 23rd of March, McDonald's made the decision to temporarily close their restaurants, drive-throughs, etc. And they soon came back a couple of months later, which really led to people, we saw those queues, didn't we, for people queuing up for their Big Macs, etc. And by the time their restaurants opened, it was a real boom to burger sales in particular. We see in this latest month that things are starting to balance out quite a lot. So the Eat Out to Help Out scheme has really helped beef volumes. And here's why. So in 2019, burgers very much outsold steaks. So what we're looking at here is just burgers and steaks eaten in. It excludes takeaways because obviously that's very prominent for burgers in particular. So what the pattern looks like for burgers so far in 2020, we see this drop off during the lockdown and then things start to come back in, but it's still a big gap to where we were a year ago. For steaks, however, we've seen the same pattern, but it's massively up on last year in the August, the 4 weeks to 6th of September, and actually outselling burgers in particular. So whether or not this continues is TBC. My thoughts are that August was probably as good as it gets. We had the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, it was well publicised by the government. You can't get better sort of marketing than that. And also the seasons were with us. People could sit outside, they could enjoy seeing people. And now we've got the seasons against us, we've got more local lockdowns, and we've got financial concerns really starting to set in. This change of habits was also seen for pork. So we see a similar trend in retail, where we see the early spike in lockdown and then things starting to ease. And what's really stimulated this has been particularly processed pig meat, and we'll have a look at that in a second. But for pig meat, you'll see this blue bar not easing as much as we saw for beef. So in the September data, actually for beef, out-of-home losses were very little. But for pork, the reason for this is the food-to-go presence. So pork sandwiches, pork-based pastry items, sausage rolls, etc. And food-to-go, as we saw, still lacks presence. And the IGD have made that forecast of minus 43% for the food-to-go market. So it's really important for pork in particular to be able to diversify the route to market for out of home. So for things like takeaways in particular, making sure the things people maybe once would have picked up just by passing, they can now get delivered to their door. So despite out of home losses for English breakfast, actually when we look at the retail picture for processed pig meat, it is quite staggering. So obviously before the pandemic, processed pig meat wasn't getting a good time of it in the media. We saw people dropping out of the categories, really wary of their processed pig meat consumption. And what we can see here in the blue and the green are the uplift for bacon and pork sausages. And a massive driver of this was more in-home cooked breakfast. So really your all-day breakfast as well, because it wasn't consumed at the breakfast occasion, it was at lunch. So in-home breakfast occasion, cooked breakfast occasions in the first 8 weeks of lockdown were up 64%. So you can see how this has really helped bacon and sausage volumes. So we can continue to play on this, as things have started to ease off, they're in line with grocery. But actually, during recessionary behaviours, it's a pretty miserable time, and it will get even worse. We can start to play on this emotion. So actually trying to enjoy yourself a little bit. And I think particularly we're going to need to play on these more subtle nudges as things like the obesity strategy come in and impact volume driving deals, particularly for sausages. So what's been really interesting for me is that bacon has passed the threshold of being £1 billion category. It's absolutely massive, and I didn't think I was going to be saying that because there's long-term losses, as I just said, for health concerns reasons. So these categories are all bought by over 80% of households. The reason I've put sliced cooked meats in there is that it is lagging behind. So we're at plus 5% in volume terms for the year to date. And we actually haven't seen household penetration of sliced cooked meats increase. So where people once maybe buying a pork sandwich out of home, it doesn't necessarily look like it's transferring in home. And it really shows that perhaps we need to do more within this area to perhaps inspire people to use sliced cooked meats beyond the sandwich. People are turning to cheese at the moment instead. So perhaps using it in the summer months, in salads, and within their cooking, perhaps in the winter months. For lamb, we are following a similar picture. No, it's completely different for lamb. And there are some negatives and there are some real positives. So for Easter, it was really perfect storm, unfortunately. So we saw this massive loss at Easter time, and this is because we weren't able to go out and prepare for Easter like we normally would. We were all in lockdown. We weren't able to gather, and particularly older shoppers were really advised to stay indoors, and lamb does have an older bias. However, since then, growth has returned, and probably way more than we expected. So growth is still driven by those aged over 65, and they're buying more chops at the moment. But actually, there's a lot of growth coming from younger shoppers at the moment. And they're buying into minced and diced lamb. So I think the focus for lamb in particular in the retail market should continue to be around versatile cuts. Even prior to COVID, there was a movement towards smaller joints, smaller cuts. I think this is really just a trend that's been accelerated. And another positive for lamb is the fact that we don't have this blue bar dragging down the market like we saw for the other sectors. And the reason for this is that lamb has a very strong bias towards takeaways. We see here that our out-of-home volumes are pretty much half and half takeaway and non-takeaway. And pretty much most of that takeaway is lamb kebabs. So lamb takeaways as a whole, in terms of in volumes that we estimate, we're up 60%, and non-takeaways down 52%, which is linked to more meat-centered meals like a lamb roast dinner. So we can see here what this trend looks like for lamb kebabs. We're tracking well above 2019 levels. It's pretty much a flat seasonal trend. And we saw this spike at early lockdown for lamb kebabs, and it is slightly, but not a great deal. So a really encouraging trend there. And I think as long as we continue to tap into the ways people want to shop, particularly for takeaways as well, making sure it's available for delivery will be really important. So where do we net out so far? So in the year to date, so up to the 6th of September, we estimate that the beef, pork and lamb have all seen marginal increases when we look at their combined volumes of retail and out of home. Beef in particular are really strong because of that massive spike at the start of lockdown. And we've seen that massive reduction in the decline for out of home volumes. However, we know people are now planning to stay in more. Like I said, the seasons are against us, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme is behind us, and people just want to stay in more now, but there's also worries about saving money and also about cleanliness. So again, all of these issues around that are going to be squeezing margins for out-of-home operators. We're having to put more in around social distancing, more sanitising, more app-based, more technology, so it's a really costly time. So therefore, when we look at our forecast for the full year, so when we factor in September, October, November, December, in addition to those figures we just saw, we think that our sectors are going to see pretty much a flat performance. So volumes for beef we think will ease back to 2%, which is partly due to the fact that we think retail growth will ease. We saw a massive spike at the start of lockdown, but it has come back quite significantly. For lamb, takeaway is continuing to boost this part of the market. And whilst we've seen retail volumes increase, which is something we didn't predict before, actually as the economy worsens, it is a high price point protein, and so people might drop it out of their baskets. And for pork, it's really that reliance on food to go that is affecting the volume forecast here. So again, things like diversifying, making sure things are available for delivery, diversifying within the out-of-home market and people are able to dine out will be really important. However, what will help it in retail that it is very price competitive. So pretty much similar price point to chicken, and we can continue to play on that high value, high taste communication for pork. So if only COVID was the only thing on people's minds, there is a lot going on right now. Like I said, it's pretty miserable, and we've got the end of the transition period coming in soon. And so I will hand over to our policy and economics expert, Sarah Baker, who will take you through what some of the trends are in that, on the economic side of things.
Thank you, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. Yes, as Rebecca said at the beginning of that presentation, 2020 really has been unprecedented. So I'm going to take you through the major economic trends, have a look what has happened and what we expect to happen going forward. Next slide, please, Beck. So at the beginning of lockdown, we saw the furlough scheme take off, and we saw huge numbers of people being furloughed in their jobs. That had a twofold effect. First of all, for those actually furloughed, it meant a reduction in income, and as soon as people's incomes are reduced, they will change their shopping behaviour. They become more aware of their outgoings, and they tighten their belts. The second thing that meant people not physically going to work means we changed the way that we consume food. So there were less sort of office lunch times, there were less purchasing of snacks in on the way to work and so on. So people were staying at home more and they had lower incomes. Now, if we look at the furlough by sector, we can see that a huge number of people in the accommodation and food services, they're one of the hardest hit sectors by definition, because as we all know, food service outlets were shut down temporarily in lockdown, and people weren't going away to stay. So again, that had a massive impact, as Rebecca has taken you through, on people's patterns of consumption. Next slide, please, Becca. As the furlough scheme began to come to an end, the first furlough scheme, should I say, businesses had to make the decision whether to take over the increased cost of keeping people on furlough, or whether to make them redundant. Now, obviously, as businesses have been through COVID and lockdown, as we know from the headlines, many businesses have really struggled, and unemployment for the first time in a long time is taking a big step up, and we expect that to continue, even though the Chancellor has announced a new furlough scheme. Next slide, please, Beck. It's less generous than the first one. Employers are expected to contribute slightly more to the scheme, and what that means is that they will think harder about keeping those workers on or making them redundant. As it looked as if we were going to go into a very steep economic decline, and then things would improve quite swiftly, I think there was a lot of optimism, hence the high take up of the furlough scheme, that we would just pick up where we left off. But now with the second wave and greater uncertainty coming, I think that's looking less and less positive. Next slide, please, Beck. So as an economist, prior to COVID, we used to talk about 2008 as the Great Recession, and economists pored over it for its reasons and the depth of the recession and the effect it had on the economy going forward. It really was the biggest thing to hit the UK economy since the 1930s. But you can see very clearly from this side that the effect of COVID has absolutely dwarfed the 2008 recession, or the credit crunch as it's otherwise known. You can see that massive decline in gross domestic product in 2020 of around 20%. That is the biggest decline since records began. So the economy literally shuddered to a halt. And that is why the range of fiscal stimulus measures that the Treasury announced, i.e. that the pumping money into the economy, was much needed, because if the economy shudders to a halt, then you get greater unemployment, then you get less consumption, and it's really a downward spiral. So it was incredibly important for the government at that stage to try and balance the economy and maintain people's jobs and their incomes and their way of life, and balance our health at the same time, facing this sort of relatively unknown pandemic. So it was a juggling act, and you can see what happened to the economy as a result. Next slide, please. Again, in that economy, you can see the disproportionate effect on accommodation and food services. They took probably the biggest hit. They took a over 80% decline in their sector-specific gross domestic product. So they literally sort of stopped overnight. A lot of workers in the accommodation and food services tend to be the younger, the part-time, the less formal employment. So again, by having that disproportionate effect on a certain sector of the population, will undoubtedly affect eating habits and shopping habits. Next slide, please. So as if COVID wasn't bad enough, we also have leaving the EU and the UK economy to wrestle with as well. Now, before COVID, we'd spent a lot of time at AHDB examining the impact of leaving the EU. They've been our major trading partner for the last 40 years. They're our closest neighbour. We had a single market. We operated as one entity. So what will happen? What would be the effect on the UK economy of leaving that? And we already knew that it was going to be seismic. It very much depends on the type of trading deal that we get with the EU. If we get a full and comprehensive free trade agreement, then we have significant disruption, but it is relatively smaller, because we have the trade frictions and the day-to-day additional bureaucracy and day one disruption. But if we leave without a trade deal, on top of that, we have the additional trade barriers, the tariff barriers, and the health measures, the physical checks on goods at ports and so on. So it's going to be difficult whether we get a trade deal or not. And at the moment, as you can see in the news, the EU and the UK future trade relationship is proving challenging to negotiate. A lot of theatre last week. Boris saying that they were over. They're back on today, and sterling's taken a bit of a rally. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens at the last moment. Next slide, please. But the biggest thing these negotiations are up against is the clock, the lack of time to negotiate this deal. Boris previously said the 15th of October was the cut-off point. The actual cut-off point is the 31st of October. If a deal is not agreed by then, the time to ratify it and the time to get the country prepared, we just basically run out of time. So at that point, we either start ramping up our no trade deal preparations, or we are assured of a smoother exit from the EU. The sticking points, as everybody is well aware, is that the level playing field. What that means is the ability of the UK to define its own level of support for agriculture, its own regulation, its own standards and so on, or how close it it stays to the EU pattern in order to not distort competition, and also the ability of EU nations to fish in UK territorial waters. So there's some speculation. Will we leave without a deal? Will we have a limited deal on goods only? Or will we go for what's euphemistically named the Australia style deal, which is no trade deal? Next slide, please. So as we've seen, there's a significant disruption at the moment within the economy. There's the potential for no trade deal. There's the re-emergence of COVID, and either one of those on their own would be absolutely massive. But combined, you saw on the chart just the effect that that's having on the economy. It doesn't look like it's going to bounce back in the way that was originally envisaged, because we look now as if we're facing a second wave, and there are increasingly stringent rules around shopping, leaving the home, and socialising. It's a challenging time for the UK economy. And from a retailer, operator and manufacturer, that there's a need for supply chains to be adaptable as possible. As Rebecca said in her talk, that the way that they've risen to the challenge of COVID, it has been quite amazing, and that's going to be increasingly important going forward. There's the potential need for more clustering and localized supply chains. People won't want to go further afield when they do their shops, and it's going to be an incredibly turbulent time for costs. So I'd be really interested in hearing from you, Rebecca, and thinking how this level of disruption within the economy is going to feed into consumer behaviour going forward.
Yeah, I think obviously our retailers and everyone in the supply chain is reacting to that consumer demand. And what we see and will continue to see is that people will, at least in the short to medium term, be maintaining their household food stocks. So in that survey in August, we saw that a third of people are planning to keep food in their cupboards, their fridges, their freezers. And I think people will still continue to kind of tap into the channels they've been trying out so far. So we think obviously that online has been accelerated as a channel for grocery shopping, but also I think butchers, I think there's a really good opportunity to sustain some of that growth that we've already seen, providing, we maintain the quality there, maintain the service, and maintain that cleanliness that people have come to expect from wherever they shop. Obviously, we know that the eating out market in particular is going to be really difficult. We're already at reduced capacity, and people are feeling much more anxious about heading out. And there isn't a deal like Eat Out to help out stimulating that demand. And within that, we don't think that people are going to be trading up in the same way that they did in the summer when eating out of home, and the same probably for retail as well. But there are some opportunities still within this. There's some consumers that are feeling okay to spend a little bit more, so there are opportunities. So in terms of what the new normal look like, the things that are going to be here to stay pretty much, we've got more people that are working from home, and I think businesses have been able to understand that people can do that, and so there will be more home working going forwards. There will definitely be more online shopping, as I just mentioned, more focus on value for money, and increased pressure on the out-of-home market. So in terms of what those opportunities are within that new normal, within the home working sort of opportunity, there's a real opportunity to inspire our consumers to be purchasing red meat and using it at different occasions at home. So particularly sort of hot and filling lunches for those that are working at home, and perhaps for those that still have to go out to their workplace, seeing it more as an enjoyment, a real treat, something a bit of a pick-me-up maybe in the evening or the weekend. I think here it's definitely all about tapping into emotion. It's not logical reasoning, it's just, yeah, I really need that pick-me-up when it comes to my food. In terms of presence, so particularly when online shopping, I mentioned before that our research in 2018 showed real challenges for fresh meat, particularly for high value and variable cuts like steaks and roasting joints. I think that we saw a number of barriers in terms of the imagery, the listings. People often don't go any further than the search results, and so there's real opportunities to make sure that we are addressing those barriers. So I think if you as a business don't have a decent e-commerce person or team, I think it's time to definitely get one. And to look at that report, you can search for AHDB online meat shopper journey. Value. So value for money is going to be big. Recessionary behaviours are going to set in. All these impacts on the economy are really going to be felt. And so it's not just about those that are really budget conscious, looking for low cost items, but it's also people perhaps looking to still save money that can perhaps still trade up a little bit. So what I mean by that is perhaps within retail, showing how premium tier is a good alternative to perhaps eating out, and particularly when we move into celebratory occasions like Christmas and New Year as well. And then in terms of innovation, particularly for the out-of-home market, it's making sure that red meat is present. So on menus, making sure that lamb and primary pork in particular are there. But this also extends to takeaways. So making sure that we are included in the dishes, so new dishes and new deals as well, to make sure people can get red meat and continue to enjoy it, both in, out of home, takeaways, regardless of how they want to consume. So I'll hand back to Kim for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca and Sarah, for that great presentation. A lot to cover in a very short space of time, but fantastic insights. Great that we're looking at both the retail and the food service market so that people can get a total market point of view. Before moving on to the Q&A, I just wanted to remind everyone to sign up, if you haven't already, to the November set of webinars hosted by the team. While these webinars this month have focused very specifically on behaviour and demand, the second look at how consumer attitudes have been impacted, particularly deep diving into important relevant industry topics such as health, British or local, the environment and animal welfare for red meat. We know that these were growing in importance and getting a lot of media attention before COVID-19, so these webinars explore how perceptions have evolved and, most importantly, what we think are the opportunities and threats in each one of these areas in the future. The webinar sign up is available on our website, which you can see on this slide, and also on there you can sign up to our bi-monthly newsletter, which informs you of what articles and reports have been published in the recent weeks, so we advise that as well. Right, so lots of questions have been coming in, so I'll move on to these. Just to flag, if we don't cover all of the questions today in this session, we will be answering them via email. Okay, so let me get the questions up. Great, so first one, I'll go for one for Rebecca first. With things as changeable as they are, how do we plan for 2021?
I mean, it's going to be incredibly difficult. Things are hugely changeable and there's a lot of unknowns, which I think Sarah highlighted brilliantly. I think what we need to think is that March to July in particular is a real anomaly. For any future planning, essentially we need to take that out and we need to be looking at 3-5 year averages and kind of using those as our benchmark, and then wherever possible using real-time data to really keep an eye on things. Because whilst in this data that I've just shown it runs up to September, and particularly for beef, stuff was starting to even out, local lockdowns coming in now have already stimulated retail growth again. So it really is changing every single week, 4 weeks, etc. And I think for what we need to remember next year as well, we are meant to have the postponed Olympics, the postponed Euros. So hopefully there will be some celebrations. We'll again wait and see. But we need to learn from those events from 2018, where we had the World Cup, 2016, where we had again Euros and Olympics. And so factoring in those extra occasions will be really important. I think for food service in particular, planning needs to be centered around having a really diverse route to market. So I think what operators did really well is suddenly pivot to takeaway only, or having different dishes, shortening their menus. And I think if you're an operator that hasn't necessarily pivoted just yet, it's time to get involved in delivery, takeaway, having more digital presence as well. And I think obviously we have to mention our agri-market outlook. So in the summer, we produced a forecast for demand, but also our market specialist team looked at some of the supply, the trade implications as well for the longer term. There is a long view within that part of the website, which you can search on our AHDB website. And the main thing to remember is always think about demand pull, listen to consumers, and if you're not having a direct contact with your consumers, speak to your customers and make sure they are speaking to your consumers as well.
Great, thank you, Beck. We've had actually a question come in which I think is very relevant to what you just said. So do we believe retail demands will spike again with more and more lockdowns? Just from a top line point of view, we do know we've seen first sight of data which runs up to the start of October, which is when local lockdowns started to increase again, and growth has gone back up to plus 11%, which is the growth figures that we were seeing more over the summer. So yes, there's definitely going to be an increase in retail if lockdowns increase even more. So one big topic on the Q&A actually is the great news about lamb. So one comment here about great to hear an increase in lamb sales among young people. How can this sector build on this trend going forward? And before I hand that back to you, Beck, we've had a couple of methodology questions about lamb kebabs, asking if we know if it's UK or imported lamb and what cuts are being used. Unfortunately, because this is demand data, we're unable to isolate supply source, but I still think it's a key insight to understand a big consumer trend which the UK lamb market should utilise going forward. But if we go back to the question about how can the sector build on the younger people trend going forward, can I pass that back to you, Beck?
Yeah, so what we've already seen so far is that younger consumers are buying more into mince and diced, so using things more as an ingredient. And we see this across the proteins. And like I said, it was a trend prior to COVID. It's just kind of been accelerated. So I think putting those cuts in particular in front of consumers will be really important. And I also think there's an opportunity still. I don't mean to keep banging on about digital, but it is obviously a massive growth. And particularly for lamb to have decent online presence. I think, we've seen a lot of extra presence for steaks. We have the 3 for 10 deals, which are very well publicised on the retailers' websites. But lamb does sometimes lack a bit of presence there. And although we've seen a lot of older shoppers buying into the online channel, actually there is still a younger skew. And so if we want to get more younger shoppers, we need to make sure that on that channel that lamb has a really decent presence. And when we think about what cuts those are, it needs to be the more ingredients-based cuts.
Great, thank you, Beck. We've had a question coming for Sarah. What are AHDB doing regarding leaving the EU and striking further trade deals?
Thank you, Kim. That's a really interesting question. Obviously, the future trade deals have been very much in the news lately. The trade deals that are currently being negotiated with the United States, with Australia and with New Zealand, and the one that's recently been concluded with Japan. AHDB are very, very focused on understanding the impact of all of these trade deals. First and foremost, the trading deal with the EU, because they have been our closest partner for the last 40 years. But going forward, each of those trade deals, and 3 out of 4 of those are with major agricultural exporters. So you can imagine a significant impact. So we've been looking very closely at sort of current patterns of trade, at the various systems of production and the costs of production in those different countries, where their current markets lie, and what price points they are selling goods at. And then we're going to follow that up with some econometric modelling onto exactly how much of that product do we expect to flow on a supply and demand basis into UK markets if we strike a free trade deal with each of those nations. So there's a wealth of information on the AHDB websites. We will be bringing out some information shortly on the US, Australia and New Zealand trade deals. But yes, there is a significant change coming. The UK is going to become a global trading nation. That's a stated aspiration of the UK government. And the key to competing in that market is to look at our productivity and our competitiveness on a global scale. So comparing those costs of production and looking at the different systems and how they differ, and how attractive the UK market is to these nations is incredibly important to understand the trade flows going forward.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to hand back to Beck, because we've had a question about a specific sector within protein. So someone would like to know how ready meals are performing during this time.
Yeah, so the short answer is not great. So as I highlighted, we've seen a bit of a swing towards scratch cooking in particular, but also we're looking at more assisted meals, so maybe components like your prepared red meat with prepared potatoes and prepared veg, for example. But ready meals in particular have really lagged behind, and in some instances for many of the proteins they are in decline. What we have seen, we will be releasing a report in a few weeks' time looking at meat reducers, and actually there are pockets there of consumers where we do think there is an opportunity for ready meals, but right at the current time actually we are seeing that they are really behind the market.
Great, thank you, Beck. I'm just going to hand back to Sarah quickly. Will the effect of the outcome of trade negotiations between the EU and UK affect the UK economy going forward?
Yes, very, very much so, Kim. I think if there's a trade deal struck with the EU, the disruption will be relatively minor. There will be trade frictions because there will be that we'll no longer be part of a single market, and as a consequence of that, there will be additional bureaucracy involved in trade, and that will cause disruption to the UK economy. But if we fail to negotiate a trade deal, we will see significant change. So we'll be facing very high tariff barriers into the EU. Their common external tariff, which we've operated under for the last 40 years, is fairly protectionist, and we will be then facing that level of protection to sell into one of our major markets. And equally, the UK government has announced the new UK global tariff, which largely mirrors that common external tariff. So our EU exporters will face that tariff selling into UK markets. So that means that there will be significant change for a number of our major commodities. There'll be for goods that we're a net exporter, having to face that high trade barrier selling into the EU means there'll be significant downward pressure on prices, for instance in lamb, and for goods that we're a net importer, the opposite is true, that there's some opportunity there for some import substitution. So yeah, a mixed bag, very dependent on if we reach that trade deal or not. And then further down the line, of course, the trade deals with the other major trading nations will have further impact. So yes, although it has since been sort of overtaken, if you like, by the COVID effect, there is no doubt that the effect of a no trade deal exit from the EU will have a profound effect on the UK economy.
Great, thank you, Sarah. We've had quite a few questions come in about some of the factors that are going to be covered more in webinar 2. So really important to sign up to that. So things such as how attitudes are changing to meat reduction, to health, to environment, etc. But one that I will ask, Beck, is how do farmers get their sustainable meat messaging to consumers versus international food company budgets for plant-based offerings?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of those plant-based products do have massive financial backing from major multinationals, but I kind of want to take out this sort of them and us sort of picture, and the key thing to remember is that those products have backing and they exist because they are listening to consumer demand, and that's exactly what red meat needs to do. Thankfully, consumers do want to hear about sustainability, and that's why within our strategy at AHDB, the new 5-year strategy, we have a core pillar which is called around reputation. So it covers everything you just mentioned around health, welfare, sustainability. And obviously we will be doing marketing campaigns in line with that. So there'll be plenty of content in the new year that will be available to share, which really highlights the importance of British farming and how sustainable it can be. I think in the short term, the BMPA have just launched sustainablebritishmeat.org, and I'd encourage that to be shared rather than take on maybe like lobbyists or individual companies one-to-one. I think having that central resource is really important. So one consistent voice and all singing from the same hymn sheet. But yeah, more on sustainability in the next webinar.
Great, thank you, Beck. We've actually had 2 questions come in about the same thing, and actually really topical for me as I started a HelloFresh subscription during lockdown. So how are food boxes performing during this time?
Yeah, so obviously massive demand for them at the current time, and it's not just the big guys like Gusto, HelloFresh, etc. It's all those sort of niche little subscriptions. Unfortunately, we don't have like any headline sales data on that, because actually within the panels that we look at, the data, they are still pretty niche still. So whilst there's sort of a lot of noise around them, a lot of offers, actually maybe the repeat purchase of these isn't as great as it was. I do think there's still an opportunity here. People are looking to sort of break up the boredom of, you know, having to think about cooking. That's why these boxes exist in the first place, and particularly at the current time, it's still incredibly relevant. And I think, like, even for small operators, there's an opportunity in this area. So even if you've got good word of mouth within your local area, why not produce a meat box, for example, and start selling that out? And I think making sure you have really good online presence, good marketing, good word of mouth could be really important.
Okay, thank you. I'm just streaming through all these questions. Probably another one that's going to be covered more in webinar 2, but maybe you could just touch on briefly, Rebecca, is with the rise in meat purchasing, are we seeing a change in consumer attitudes to meat reduction?
Yeah, so what we've been seeing, particularly we've looked at primary red meat, is an increase in household penetration during the pandemic. So what I mean by that is the proportion of households buying primary red meat. And it was quite a surprise, really, that people have come back into the categories. So part of it will be people that maybe don't cook meat in home, they only eat it out of home, and instead, you know, they can't do that, so they are buying into the category now. But actually, you know, we've seen sustained growth in this area. And at the same time, meat-free products have seen a reduction in household penetration, which is really unusual. Probably quite short term. I think some of these trends we're seeing over the last few months, and probably for a few months now, will essentially be reversed. We'll go back to the trend that we saw previously, where meat-free products were continuing to grow, and people still thinking about where their meat comes from, how much they are consuming. So I think that long-term trend we will go back to. But actually, in the short term, there does seem to have been a shift. And I think a big part of that is that whole thing around, you know, just the emotional aspect of food that we were talking about, and people just wanting to enjoy what they're eating at home.
Great, thank you, Beck. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to make this the last question for you, Rebecca. Do you believe that those that are working from home that now have more disposable income from no commuting will trade up their retail meat purchasing? So do we think that we'll see demand for more premium cuts increase?
I think it's still to be seen how people really feel. I think at the moment we're still in the midst of the furlough scheme. Sarah covered the new job scheme coming in November, and I think there's still a lot of people that still feel like they're going to be better off. So like we say, those people that are able to save a bit of money by not buying their coffee, not commuting, etc. And I think I do think in general that we will see some of those people being able to trade up, and it'd be really important at Christmas to really tap into those people. So, you know, reaching them via the media outlets that they would normally see advertising for certain products, certain retailers, etc. But yeah, I think that generally the overall impact of the economy is yet to be fully felt.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously some of the factors that usually feed into premium cuts, such as being British, etc., is something that's going to be covered in webinar 2. So I think that's a good place to leave today with just a couple of minutes to spare. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to Rebecca and Sarah for the great presentations today and the great Q&A session that we've just had. And thank you to everyone who's attended as well. We hope that you found it useful. And just to reiterate, we will be answering any questions that we haven't had time for directly afterwards. And lastly, just a reminder, when you do close this down, if a feedback box pops up, please remember to fill it in, especially if you want to receive the slides that you've seen today. So thank you very much again to everyone, and see you soon.